Welcome to Season 2 of the Robertson and Easterling podcast. I'm Craig Robertson.
And I'm Matt Easterling. Craig and I are board-certified family law specialists with decades of combined experience serving Mississippians all across our fine state.
In 2019, we began to wonder if the struggles our firm deals with on a daily basis could be used to help the general public. And from there, the Robertson and Easterling podcast was born.
During Season 1, we had open and honest discussions with everyday people about their individual relationship journeys, some ending in heartbreak and others in redemption, but all with powerful stories to tell.
In this season, you'll hear more of the same real-life stories from other marriage and divorce survivors, which are sure to touch your heart.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy today's episode. What you're about to hear is going to help.
In today's podcast, we're going to talk about co-parenting. One of the biggest challenges when relationships fall apart is for two people to stay focused on the best interests of their children. And I am grateful to have with us today someone who has been able to do that. Today, we're with a longtime client named Scott. And Scott found himself as a relatively young man with a very serious legal situation. So, Scott, as always, it's great to be with you. Thank you for being here to have others learn from the road that you've taken.
Well, thank you for having me. And I remember from one of the very first times that you and I sat down, you told me from the get-go that it wasn't about me. It was about my son. And so that really got ingrained and stuck in there that all of this wasn't about me and it wasn't about his mother. It was about him, right? And getting the best outcome and best circumstances for him. And so it's, as you said, it's been a long journey. There was bumps along the way, but I think a good journey in the end.
And Scott, so for our listeners, so they know, our relationship goes back 13 years now, right?
That's right.
That's when you first darkened the doors to initially sit down with Craig. And then I've had the pleasure of working with you as well. Tell everybody just how everything started.
Okay. Well, I found myself 19, 20 years old. I dated someone off and on through high school into the early years of college, and we found out that we had a baby on the way. At that point in time, I had no plans to have a baby. She didn't either. But it was one of those situations where it happened, and so we're going to take this and we're going to try and make it work, right? And so we did that in the beginning. We tried to make things work. We tried to be civil. We tried to work together. In the end, that didn't work out. We tried, but it just wasn't meant to be. So when my son was about a year old, that's when we both came to the conclusion that it wasn't going to work. And that's kind of where the first time that I walked in the door to sit down with Craig was at that point in time, because I knew I wanted to be involved in his life. I didn't know how to do that or what I could do to make sure I was protecting my rights to be able to be involved and then protecting his rights to make sure that I was involved.
Scott, I think you know this, but I've loved you from the very first meeting that we had with one another. And one of the biggest reasons is because I just get so inspired by men who, notwithstanding their circumstances, really step up to the plate and act like a man. And God, that's one of the things that I have always been impressed about you, is that from that very first meeting as a 21-year-old kid, you acted like a man. What motivated you?
I just knew that my son was coming into the world for a reason. And so to me, when I look back at where I was at that point in time in life, I wasn't necessarily on the right path, right? I wasn't on a path to getting out of school anytime soon. I wasn't on the path to deciding what I wanted to do. But at that point in time, he came along and I knew I wanted to be a part of his life. And to me, if I look back at my life, it was kind of a catalyst that kind of got me jump-started and said, okay, you got to get your act together, right? Okay, because you can't be that 21 wild and crazy college kid who's worrying about where we're going to go tonight. I haven't worried about what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, right? I got to start thinking big picture. And so that really jump-started at that moment in time that, okay, the fun is over, the wild and crazy days of college. It's time to get serious and really look at life and what am I going to make of myself and what am I going to make for my son?
So what I heard you say is that your son really was the catalyst. He lit the fuse for becoming an adult.
Without a doubt.
So you come to see Craig. You want to be involved in your son's life. How long did that initial legal proceeding take from beginning to end?
The first time through, because as you know, as when I'm sure we'll get into this, there's been several different occasions throughout. But the first experience, it was about an 11-month process, right? From the moment I walked in Craig's door till we had some kind of long-standing resolution as to what things were going to look like moving forward.
And I think that's something that our listeners should hear. Very few people, especially if they have very young children, are able to create a legal resolution and then that resolution work for the remainder of the childhood of, their son or daughter. Oftentimes, as life happens, as circumstances change, along the way, those things have to be modified. The legal terminology for that is a material, unanticipated change in circumstances. And when those unanticipated changes in circumstances are having adverse effects on a child, a court can relook at the custody factors and make a decision as to whether or not custody should change, whether or not there should be a restructuring of a visitation schedule. Essentially, when you have a child with someone that you are not married to and there is a legal resolution, those aspects touching their care, custody, support, both financially and emotionally, are always subject to being changed. And Scott, that sort of has been your story along the way.
That's right. And you told me that from the get-go, that no matter where things stand at the end of this beginning of this process, it's not set in stone forever, right? I mean, when you think about it, it's a 2-year-old child. There's a whole lot of runway left, right, in the childhood. And so things are going to change, and that has certainly been the case in my life and in my son's life. Things have evolved and changed over time.
Yeah, in divorces or different family law actions, there are some things that once they're decided, they're decided. But anything dealing with a child is not permanent. It is subject to being changed, to evolving, or to, being modified later. Coming out of that initial legal case, which you said took about 11 months, you secured a schedule that was going to allow you to be very involved in your child's life. Things remained pretty civil with your child's mother throughout that process, right?
For the most part, during that 11-month period in time, when you're going through legal proceedings and you've made the decision that you're not going to be with someone else, typically there's many reasons that you're not with someone, right? You may not always see eye to eye. You may not get along. So there were certainly bumps in the road where we didn't agree on things. But I think for the most part, we've always tried to be as civil as possible, especially when we're around our son, right? Because we want him to not see any animosity that may have been there or that could be there. We want to keep him away from that and just let him be a kid, because he's a kid and he deserves that. And so we've worked really hard to do that.
Sure. It's important for people to know that just because you don't agree with somebody on a particular subject doesn't mean that you can't have respect for them and respect for who that person is in your life or who that person is to your child. And that's something that I've always gotten from you, is that no matter what was going on in y'all's lives, you maintained a level of respect for your child's mother and the place that she takes in his life.
Talk about the extended family dynamics, because you were a young man, only 20 years old when your son was born. How did the dynamics of your extended family, both on your side and on your child's mother's side, play into what transpired over the years to come?
No, I think we both had support systems. We both had our families, our parents who were there supporting each of us. And being a parent now, I know that as a parent, you're going to champion your child 100%, right? And you're going to back them up. And I fully understand that as my child has gotten older and I have additional children now with my wife. But with that, I think that a lot of times family is so pulled in one direction that sometimes they're pulling you one way and it kind of clouds the water, right? Or kind of muddies it a little bit, right? So I think that we had that support system, but we each had that support system that was pulling us in opposite directions and didn't always bring us together to promote compromise.
What I heard you say, and I know your parents, and I adore your parents.
I love my parents. They're fantastic.
And especially your mom. She texts me still to this day.
I'm sure.
She texts me on my feet when I'm in open court, and she texts me periodically. Now,
I wouldn't expect anything less.
But one thing that I heard you say is that, we as parents are advocates for our children, but sometimes in that advocacy, we don't always see the big picture or our love and adoration for our child can sometimes overshadow the full component of, making sure we raise great human beings.
I think that's perfectly worded.
So you finished your first journey through the legal system. We created a resolution. And as in any child custody visitation case, the resolution involved, the custody of your child. For those new listeners, 2 types of custody in Mississippi. There's physical custody and there is legal custody. Physical custody is who a child actually lives with, and legal custody is the thinking side of custody. And then there is an access schedule or a parenting plan, a visitation schedule, lots of different words for it. And then we take care of the financial aspects of caring for a child. Those include, child support, daycare expenses, extracurricular activities, and then, as they get older, possibly private school educations, college, cell phones, automobiles. So all the financial dynamics of raising a child. So you found yourself with a resolution. We now know that would not be the permanent resolution. So talk about life after that first court case.
So after that, we started, going by the agreement, right? We started, visitation schedules, which I had a very generous visitation schedule. I had the ability to see my son on a consistent basis, many days throughout the week. So that was great. And we went on that schedule and we went by that resolution for several years after that. Nothing really changed, except for a few, like we might tweak a holiday here or there. We pretty much stuck very rigidly to what the agreement said. And we did that. I think it was good for both of us because we weren't necessarily at the best point in time in our relationship and co-parenting at that point in time, because it had been that experience. We'd been drug out and, we'd made the decision we didn't want to be together. So we didn't really know how to work together very well at that point. So we just went by the resolution and did exactly what it said. As our son got older and as he got closer to going to school and school age, that's when we looked back at it, and the agreement that was in place at that point in time really necessarily wasn't going to be the best situation for him at that point in time. So we looked at, what do we need to do at this point to change it or to modify this?
Right. If I remember correctly, you and your child's mother lived in close proximity to one another. So you were able to actually spend many days a week with him, even if it was just for a few hours in the afternoon after school. But when you're in close geographic proximity and the child is really young, you can have that type of flexibility. But as your son entered school age and there was a little bit of a geographic separation between you and your child's mother, that became increasingly difficult. And so that's what we say when a visitation schedule is not working as written, and we have to relook at it and reshape it so that it fits the new dynamics of the family and specifically the child.
That's right. And I'll be perfectly honest, when this came about, I didn't bring this up. I didn't look and say that that we need to look at changing this. His mother brought this upon me. And at that point in time, I wasn't necessarily very happy about it because I liked the schedule that we had and I thought it was a good schedule and that we shouldn't necessarily change it. But, she looked at it and said from the geographic distance, it was a relatively short distance in between us and going to school, that maybe we should look to change the schedule. And looking back at it now, I think that was the right decision. So I can give her credit that at that point in time, that was the right thing to look at it. And let's do adjust this a little bit to make it more feasible for us and more feasible for him.
Yeah, and I think that, there's this balancing act that parents have to do because, there really is a benefit and a burden to all parents. And in a lot of ways, we cherish our kids so much that sometimes our vision gets clouded by that. We want our time with them. We feel like we're legally entitled to our time with them. But, sometimes it takes someone else who has a little distance or has a little different perspective to give us feedback to be the catalyst for something new.
That's right. And again, kind of going back, as the parent, you're so focused on doing it this way and looking at it this way. It's definitely, to me, having y'all that we could bounce ideas off of or that I could come to and talk to has been tremendous throughout this entire process.
I think as parents, we love our children so much that sometimes it is easy to let our feelings and our desires to be around our children or to experience things with them cloud what is actually in their best interest. So it's easy to convince yourself, well, it's in their best interest to be, with me during this particular event. And you're feeling that way mainly because of your desire to be with them, not as much because it's actually in their best interest. So parents are usually, they have good intentions. It's just very difficult to take their own feelings out of it and focus solely on your child. And if I'm hearing you correctly, you can look back on it now and say that, that change in the schedule was a good thing and ended up working well, for your son, even though at the time you weren't that happy about it because it meant that you might get a little less time than what you had enjoyed before, right?
That's right. That's exactly the first feeling. And that's me, the individual, thinking about myself. And again, not necessarily putting the child, really thinking about what is actually best for the child in that instance. And so that was the fear. I mean, I remember the fear within me. I was fearful that I wasn't going to be able to spend as much time or see him or be involved in his life. It actually worked out the opposite. In that instance, we were able, without having, to go through, a full-blown out legal proceeding and having to go to court, we were able to work together and put together a resolution that we came up with on our own as an agreement as to what it was going to look like going forward.
So legal action number 2 settled. You didn't have to go to court.
That's right.
And just very quickly, I want to touch on something that you just said. I think it's important for our listeners. Just because your child does not live with you the majority of the time doesn't mean that you can't be intimately involved in almost all areas of their life. You can go to soccer practice. You can be the soccer coach. You can go to recitals. You can go to these practices, the things that are happening at the school. Just because it's not your designated night where your child is going to be sleeping under your roof that night, it doesn't make you any less their father or their mother. You can still be involved in all of their daily activities.
100%. I mean, when he was in elementary school, kindergarten, first grade, every volunteer opportunity that you could possibly do, and in those grades, you get a lot of choices and a lot of opportunities to go help in the classroom. I was there. Coach soccer every year that he played. So you can get involved and be there, whether it's your designated time or not. It just takes the effort on your part to step up and do that.
Hey, this is Kaylin Dunnels. I'm an associate attorney here at Robertson and Easterling. Look, visiting with our attorneys does not mean you're going to get a divorce. It simply means you are choosing to arm yourself with information about how the Mississippi legal system works. After a meeting with me or one of our other attorneys, you'll feel like the weight of the world has been lifted from your shoulders, and you'll have a plan for the next steps you need to take. Remember, the fact we even spoke is totally confidential. Click on the link on our website or just call the office. We would love to get to know you better. Until then, take care and enjoy the second half of our show.
So after you guys settled legal action number 2, how long did you live under that order?
I'm going to say that was another couple years. Let's see, that would have been around kindergarten. And so we worked under that resolution until the third grade, end of second grade. So it would have been going into third grade. A couple years after that resolution.
Scott, parenting is a 2-person job. And once your son became school age, he learned differently than other kids. And, we know now that I think 1 in 5 children have some level of dyslexia and some level of learning challenge. And that's something that your family had to deal with, right?
That's right. And so our son is dyslexic, and that's been a challenge. That was a struggle academically early on in school for him, figuring out what was going on. When we got his diagnosis, we were able to take steps to help him, start correcting is probably not the right word, but starting taking action towards putting things in place to help him learn in his own way, right? I mean, to me, we kind of say that 1 in 5 learn differently. I think each and every one of us learn differently, right? We all do, right? And so we just had to find ways that worked for him. What did he need to learn? And one of the greatest blessings he's ever had in his life is his dyslexia tutor. She worked with him every single week for over 2.5 years, helping him work through this and learning to read and sound out words phonetically his way, the way that worked for his brain and the way that he's wired. So that was a huge, tremendous blessing for him.
Scott, we talked about that you guys were in the middle of dyslexia tutoring, the initial dyslexia tutoring that a child will do as they create a toolkit so they can learn how to read. And, you learn to read, then you read to learn. And during the middle of that, you receive communication from your child's mother that there was going to be a big move. Talk about that.
That's right. A big move. We talked about how there'd been a little geography in between us, but towards the end of that school year, after his initial diagnosis and in the beginning process of starting tutoring, she presented the potential that there may be a very big move with a whole lot of geographical difference in between us, about 6 hours worth of drive time in between the two. So for my son, that was a very challenging time because he's just starting to go through the process of the dyslexia tutoring. He's just starting to, get his feet wet, learn this process and go through this. And then we're going to have the potential that it's going to be a complete, 180 for him, right? A complete change in life and lifestyle. It's going to be a change of being actively involved with both of his parents on a pretty almost, weekly, if not more consistent basis, to where he's going to be very far away. He's going to have a new school environment, new processes, new tutors, all those challenges and changes. And I wasn't just necessarily sure that was the best thing for him at that point in time.
Right. And so we did have to file a court case in an attempt to modify custody. And I think, I've been doing this for 20 years now, but your situation was very unique in that both of your child's parents are good people and they have involved grandparents. But this was a situation where there was a significant move. You said a drive time of 6 hours. And typically speaking, a move for a legitimate reason, a job change, a remarriage. There are lots of legitimate reasons that people have to move. And typically in Mississippi, that's not a reason to modify custody. But you had the unique situation where there was this material, significant change in circumstances, not just in the geographic move, but that your child learned differently. And there had been put in place a treatment regimen for that. And so you had a true situation where the living situation was really necessary for his nurturing and development at that time.
I would agree. We'd found, like I said, he had a fantastic tutor that really connected with him and that was really helping him. And we were seeing progress that was happening very, very rapidly. And for him to have struggled, previously academically and then to see progress quickly start to go in the right direction, it's one of those things where that's a game changer for him, right? Finding the way to learn, figuring those things out, mastering those things that have been a challenge and working around that's going to impact the rest of his life. So it's not just that you're looking at the geographic distance. You're looking and saying if we make this change, is this having the potential to have a negative impact on him for many, many years to come? And I felt like it did have that potential. I felt like the plan that we had in place and what we were doing, his school, his tutor, the whole surrounding, setting, his support system was so important to him at that point in time that it was worth taking it back and looking at it again.
So you had this complex, intricate network set up to, help your son springboard, forward academically. And as we moved into that modification case, unfortunately, we did have to litigate it, and ultimately the court agreed it was best for your son to stay in that network that you guys had set up, right?
That's correct. It was, again, another process. In this instance, and I know this is very abnormal, it was a very short process, right? I mean, it was one of those things where if this change is going to happen, it's going to happen over the course of a summer. And so we had to move very, very quickly. You guys were fantastic, jumped right in, head first, and we made this happen very, very quickly. We did have to go through the court process. We did have to go through litigation. We got to a point, though, with that outcome to where the court agreed that it was in his best interest to stay here, continue on the path that he was on. It was exciting news, for me and for my family. From our perspective, I was very excited, for him and very excited for us that he was going to be here. But on the other side, I can't speak for his mother, but I think that was probably very challenging for her to process, right? Because that was a complete change. She'd always had physical custody. Physical custody was going to now be with me. He was going to live with me. And I'll give her kudos. I mean, going through that process, looking back, I don't know that I would have handled it as well as she did. She handled it about as good as I think anybody possibly could, going through a change like that for her personally. So I'll give her all the credit in the world on that.
Right. And I don't remember your case as being one, it was not really a situation where the parents attacked each other. It really, I believe, was more focused on your child and what his needs were at that time. And that's a little unusual because I think that it's real easy for things to get nasty. I mean, when you have a child with a person, that's a very special relationship. And a lot of times our deepest, darkest secrets can be weaponized against one another. But you guys really didn't do that in that proceeding. It really was more about the academic side, the focus on what was best for your child.
Right. I mean, and that goes back to that very first conversation that you and I had. You told me in that conversation, I can remember it like it was yesterday, that this isn't about me. It's about him. And so I've always looked at it from that way, the best that I can. As a parent with my own feelings, sometimes those glasses get a little foggy, right? But you try your hardest to do that. And I think we really did try hard not to sling mud, not to be negative. Of course, there probably was some of that along the way. I think that's just, sometimes just happens, but it wasn't intentional. I think we both tried to be as civil as you possibly can be in those situations because it brings up emotions in each of you, and it's hard to be civil. I mean, it takes effort to be civil sometimes, but sometimes you got to make that effort.
Talk about the season of time that there was that geographic distance between the two of you. How did you guys manage?
I think that in that instance, that has really what's made our co-parenting to where it is now. It's certainly improved over time. It's one of those things where, as you give it time, things get better, right? And our co-parenting certainly has with the distance. You've got a co-parent in between there, right? There was a visitation schedule to where he would visit 2 times a month back and forth. So that's a pretty 6 hours there and back over a weekend is a pretty long haul. So you got to make effort to communicate all the different intricacies of that, transfer. And then you got to talk about, academic life and what's going on because one parent is geographically farther away. So that makes it a little bit harder to be as involved.
I remember one, I'm going to call it exercise that we went through during your modification case that I think is one of the best ways to get a person to identify whether or not their feelings about seeing their child is fogging what might actually be in their best interest. And that is the creation of that proposed visitation schedule. Because when we did that with you, we had to look at it from the perspective of, we don't know if you're going to have custody or if you're not going to have custody. So this schedule, you have to look at it as, is this something that you're going to be able to live under, whether you're the custodial parent or the non-custodial parent? Because if we suggest a schedule that maybe you're going to love best as the custodial parent, what if we lose? Then you might be living on the wrong end of it. And that was a very real moment watching you go through, okay, well, I have to take myself out of it and not look at it as to which side of this I'm going to be on, which one is going to work best, for my child.
Oh, certainly. I remember doing that, and it was an incredible challenge. And the order that came down from the court was pretty much the proposed visitation schedule that we'd given, with one minor change in the one that we'd given. We actually stated that the non-custodial parent would get 2 visits a month, but one would be in their hometown and one would be in the child's hometown. The court changed it to where both were in the non-custodial parent's hometown, so the child had to travel twice a month. But it was originally set up to where that one parent was going to come home or one time a month and then go visit the other time a month.
And what I heard you say during that, and Matt, I think that was a great point for 2 reasons. Number one is whether you work with our firm or whether you work with some other firm, it's important to articulate to a court exactly what you want the court to do. And in Scott's situation, there was going to be one parent that lived 6 hours away from the other parent. Theirs was not a situation where Scott was at liberty to move closer to his child's mother because of his other obligations and responsibilities and work. But so what we did was we created a non-custodial parent visitation schedule, and it put Scott in a position where he had to think in terms of, okay, if I'm the non-custodial parent, this is going to be my access schedule. And if I am the custodial parent, this is going to be my child's mother's access schedule. But what I heard you say, which I've never really thought of before, but in your situation, because there was a 6-hour distance, it made communication critical. You had to communicate about meeting times for visitation. You had to communicate about school and extracurricular activities. It forced you guys into a situation, if you wanted to both stay involved, that communication was critical.
Right, because we'd both always been involved, but communication between us hadn't always been the greatest, right? Or it hadn't always had to really even exist because we were always in close proximity. We could do exchanges and things like that. We were always just either at a sporting event or it would just work itself out. With the distance, that changed. You had to communicate that, right? You had to communicate things about what were going on at school, what was academics looking like, all those different things. So it forced us to where we had to communicate. And I think that's been a great thing because it started off very small, very little communication. But over time, it's gotten much, much better to where either one of us now will pick up the phone if we have a question about, hey, what's going on, or can we do something different? And we talk about it and we make changes on the fly. I mean, sometimes with visitation and things like that. I mean, we work together to, if it's a holiday and we need to change this, we'll change it. Whereas in before, I told you we were pretty rigid on sticking with what that schedule was. But now we're much more understanding. We're each willing to give, compromise. I mean, compromise is key to relationships, right? You can't always be right. Y'all are both married. I'm married now, right? You got to give and take. And it's certainly the case in a relationship like this where you're co-parenting with someone that's not a spouse. Right. There has to be give and take.
Right. You can either be happy or you can be right. Pick one.
Happy's better.
So we are now, is it 3 or 4 years removed from the last legal action?
4.5.
Wow, time flies. So tell us, I mean, how's everybody doing right now?
Everybody's doing fantastic. Like I said, I'm married. I got married way back in the process several years before the last court proceeding. My wife and I, we have 2 children together now. And then my son's mother has actually moved back a little bit closer. So there's not as much geographic distance in between now. And that's made things a little bit easier just because there's not so much drive time spent on visitation time. It's actually time you can do stuff and have fun and be together. So I think all in all, I'd say everyone's in a really good place.
Scott, we've been in a relationship now for a long time. And I know that when you and your wife had your first child, there were special challenges. Could you talk about those challenges and how that impacted ultimately your relationship with the mother of the child that we've been talking about today?
Right. And so our first child together was born soon after this court case ended, right? So soon after, our life changed pretty dramatically, right? Because our son came to live with us, and that had never been the case on a full-time basis. And soon after that, we had a baby. So life changed pretty dramatically in our household in just a matter of a couple months. And then, after our son was about 1.5 years old, we started to have some concerns. My wife started to notice that he wasn't, talking as much, and he'd actually kind of regressed a little bit with words and vocabulary. So we stayed on top of it. Our pediatrician just kept telling us, wait a little bit longer, wait till he's 2. We'll look at things there. Of course, 2 came around. Things had not gotten any better. So we started looking further and got some testing. We found out that our son is autistic. He's on the spectrum. It's a challenge for him, but to me, it's another one of those blessings, one of those catalysts that's been in life. It's been another spark, right? Because you want to see him succeed. You want to push as hard as you can. It's certainly strengthened our relationship, between myself and my wife, because there is challenges every day in our household. I think every household has challenges, right? But with a special needs child, you've got certain challenges that are going to be there. It's forced us to have good, clear communication. And then in that instance with, my oldest son's mother and co-parenting, there has to be communication in there too, right? Because there's another added thing that's happening in our son's life. Now he has a special needs brother. And so with that comes different things. There's therapies and different things that our oldest son can be involved in and be a part of. But you want to make sure that you're communicating that with the other co-parent to make sure that they're okay with that. And she's been fantastic with that. And she's all in, wanting him to be as actively involved in therapies that we do for our special needs child and all those things. And he was just at therapy earlier this week. And my co-parenting partner actually dropped him off to be at therapy with our middle child now because we have a baby. So it's things have come a long, long way.
Scott, here in our just last few minutes that we have, talk a little bit about how things are today, how you do co-parent. Give us a peek into your life today.
I think it's communicating, whether it's, a grade at school, a report card, where we're always talking to each other, whether they're good grades, bad grades, they're all in between, right? And it's our son's responsibility to put in the work to get those grades. We communicate on those on a consistent basis. Back to the visitation schedule, things change, right? You may have somebody that's come in town to visit, or there may be a birthday or an anniversary, all these things. We try our best to work on it, right? And going back to, just last year when my wife and I's daughter was born, in that moment in time, there was a special moment that was going on for my son's mother's sister. And she'd asked if he could go be involved in that. And that was one of those instances to where it wasn't exciting for me to say that, honestly, we can't do that right now because we've got a baby that's going to be born any day now. And we really would prefer that he wouldn't be out of town. But again, we had that conversation. She understood 100%. She agreed and said, you know what? I think you're right. Let's let him stay here. He won't go on this trip with us. So even in instances where the other side doesn't necessarily get the outcome that they want, it's been that way for me too, but that was just an example. We've still continued to co-parent after that, right? We haven't let that be a roadblock and say, oh, just because one time it didn't work out the way that I wanted it to, we're not going to come back and try this again. We continue to keep coming back and communicating.
All right, Scott, this is going to be I hope a challenging question for you. Let's say that you're a speaker and you're in an auditorium full of 21-year-old Scots. Now here you are, 13 years removed from that. What do you say to that room full of your young proteges?
That's a great question. Now, I think that number one, never give up. It's life. There's going to be roadblocks. You're going to get hit. You're going to stumble. You're going to fall. Never give up. Keep going. Get back up the next day. Try again. Always, do your best. Put your loved ones before yourself and just never give up. I think that's been the story of my life, is never giving up. I tell my oldest son, every single day, outwork the person next to you, because if you outwork them, you're going to be ahead. So hard work pays off. Always continue to outwork your counterparts that are around you. But those are the two things that come to mind.
And what perspective would you give on parenting on this 13-year journey that you've been on?
Never say never, for one. That's the first thing that I learned early on. Never say never. But know that it's going to have joys. It's going to have ups, downs, challenges, everything in between. But it goes by so fast. I can't believe it's been 13 years. I can't believe it's been 4 years, since my middle child was born. I can't believe it's been 4 months since my daughter was born. Time goes by so fast. Take the time to enjoy it, right? In life today, we're all so busy. We're going. Sometimes you just got to stop and enjoy the moment.
Well, if you listeners heard that sound, that was the mic drop.
Scott, thank you for being with us today. Your story is inspirational and one that I think is going to fill our listeners with some hope. There are a lot of people that are listening right now that are in a dark place and that aren't sure that things can work out. And I think that your story, the story of your son and your son's mother, is a great testament to the way things can work out. And, if you maintain respect for the other person, stay focused on your child, everybody can make it through and make it through successfully. And even in the moments when you don't particularly agree, that you can stay civil and there can be life after those disagreements. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you guys for having me. It's been a blast.
You've been listening to the Robertson and Easterling podcast. Thanks for tuning in.
If you need our help, we would love to hear from you. You can request a consultation from our website 24 hours a day, and it takes less than 5 minutes. If you like our show, subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or your favorite podcast player. We want you to be one of the first to know when our next episode drops.
Have a great rest of your day, and remember, there is nothing wrong with arming yourself with information. On behalf of the Robertson Easterling family, thanks for spending time with us. This podcast is not a substitute for an attorney. All information is provided as a general reference and public service. Listening to this podcast does not create a professional relationship with Robertson and Easterling or any of its attorneys or guests. This podcast may be considered advertising, and free background information is available upon request. For more information, please visit our website, www.robertson.ms.